You're not here by accident. If certain patterns keep showing up in how you think, how you move, how you read situations, then you're not simply intelligent in the common sense. You're volatile in a controlled way. Dangerous, but disciplined. Most people spend their entire lives trying to appear smart. They stack information like trophies. They memorize lines that sound impressive. They speak quickly, raise their volume, flood conversations with opinions, and mistake visibility for substance. Noise becomes their proof. But that was never the measure of intelligence for people who actually understood power. Real intelligence was never about display. It was about command. Command over yourself when someone presses the wrong nerve. Command over the environment when everyone else is disoriented. Command over the final result when emotions hijack the room and logic collapses. Because intelligence doesn't live in storage. It lives in execution. It's not what sits in your head. It's what you can apply without advertising it, without telegraphing intention, without sacrificing leverage. Most people blur the line between knowing and mastering. The old strategists never did. They measured intelligence by self-command, situational command, and outcome command. And here's the reality most people avoid. The world doesn't crown the person who looks smartest on paper. It elevates the one who understands human behavior, senses power dynamics, and moves at the right moment. The reward doesn't go to the loudest thinker. It goes to the one who stays composed while others spiral, who notices structure while others chase chaos, who keeps their mouth closed while others trade their dignity for a few seconds of attention. These aren't academic skills. They're survival skills in the real world. They allow you to read people, anticipate shifts, and move with intent while everyone else reacts on impulse. So if you've ever felt slightly out of sync, like your mind runs on a different operating system, like you pick up on undercurrents others miss, like you sense the atmosphere change before a single word is spoken, then this isn't entertainment for you. It's recognition. Because the sharpest mind in the room rarely declares itself. It doesn't have to. It allows itself to be underestimated. It allows others to expose their hands. It allows the noise to rise while it quietly secures position. As we move through these 7 traits, keep a mental count, because more often than not, the most restrained presence carries the deepest edge. And don't consume this passively. Don't treat it like background noise. Treat it like a reflection. If these traits feel familiar, it means you weren't built for the obvious route. You were built for leverage. Built to win without pleading. Built to move like someone who understands the rules beneath the rules. These are the 7 traits that separate those who command outcomes from those who just command attention. Before we go any further, anchor this in your mind. Say it, even if only to yourself. I move with control. Now we begin with the trait that unsettles loud people the most. Strategic silence. Because silence is not absence. Silence is placement. Most people speak to reassure themselves that they belong. They rush to fill every gap with commentary, humor, explanations, stories. Not because those words carry weight, but because stillness scares them. Silence feels like exposure. It threatens attention. It invites judgment. It risks invisibility. But if this trait belongs to you, pauses don't intimidate you. You understand something most never grasp. Attention is a resource. And you don't burn it impulsively. You allocate it deliberately, like capital deployed only when the return justifies the cost. That's the real nature of strategic silence. It has nothing to do with shyness. Nothing to do with introversion. Nothing to do with weakness. It's the awareness that every sentence you release reveals 3 coordinates. Your desire. Your fear. Your direction. So when the timing is wrong, you don't spill information. You don't bleed emotion. You don't announce intention just to feel included. You hold position. And while you hold, something predictable unfolds. Others start filling the space. They explain themselves. They disclose too much. They rationalize. They defend. They posture. They attempt to impress or recruit you into their perspective. And if you understand the game, you don't interrupt that flow. Because people expose their true shape when they speak without resistance. Their ego surfaces when it's unchallenged. Their motives leak when there's no opposition. Their vulnerabilities appear when they believe they're steering the moment. Silence grants them that illusion. So you allow it. You let them talk long enough for their priorities to surface. Long enough for insecurity to show through the cracks. Long enough for the distance between what they claim and what they value to become visible. That's how advantage is gained without confrontation. Strategic silence also alters how you're perceived. When you don't rush to respond, attention shifts toward you. People begin to study you. To weigh you. To wonder what's happening behind your eyes. You become less readable, and unreadable minds are difficult to control. Think about it. Constant talkers are easy to map. Their next move is obvious. But the one who listens first carries gravity. That presence feels denser. Sharper. As if more is being processed than expressed. And that's accurate, because you're not treating conversation as a performance. You're treating it as reconnaissance. You're listening beneath the words. Tracking who seeks dominance, who seeks approval, who provokes for reaction, who hunts status. You notice patterns in emphasis, in avoidance, in repetition. Then, and only then, you speak. And when you do, the impact is different. Because you don't unload explanations. You deliver decisions. One precise question that forces alignment. One sentence that reorients the space. One measured statement that redirects momentum. That's why strategic silence signals intelligence. It converts speech from a reflex into an instrument. Not a habit. A tool. And here's what most people overlook. This trait isn't limited to social settings. It governs your inner world as well. Strategic silence means restraint over impulse. It means the message you don't send. The reaction you don't indulge. The plan you don't announce prematurely. The argument you don't step into just because someone tried to pull you down to their level. You allow time to do the heavy lifting. You let patience apply pressure. You let others reveal exactly where they stand before you move. And when you do move, it's clean. Controlled. Intentional. Here's the turn most people never see coming. This discipline isn't limited to how you show up around others. It governs how you restrain yourself when no one is watching. Strategic silence means you can interrupt your own impulses. It means the message you choose not to send, the reaction you refuse to give, the urge you don't obey just because it's loud. You don't fire back when emotion spikes. You don't reveal intentions before the ground is ready. You don't wrestle with people who are trying to pull you into their chaos. You allow time to apply the pressure for you. You allow patience to do the squeezing. You let behavior accumulate until positions become obvious, and only then do you act. Anchor this now. Say it quietly if you need to. I speak with purpose. The next trait is where most people lose leverage without realizing it. Reading real motives. This is where many get outplayed because they listen to words instead of tracking direction. The average person treats conversation like a literal exchange, as if statements arrive clean and intentions are printed on the surface. They assume clarity equals honesty and tone equals truth. It sounds polite. It's also how people get steered, boxed in, and used without ever seeing the hand on the wheel. If this trait belongs to you, you don't get hypnotized by presentation. You study what fuels the message because motives don't live inside sentences. They hide inside patterns, especially patterns that surface when pressure enters the room. Anyone can sound reasonable when nothing is at stake. Anyone can appear loyal when the cost is zero. Anyone can act supportive when sacrifice isn't required. But the moment someone must choose between their image and their advantage, their real priorities step forward. That's why you don't stop at what was said. You ask a sharper question. What is this moving toward? What outcome benefits them? And this doesn't require suspicion. It requires awareness. You notice who suddenly appears only when they need access. You notice who becomes warm right before they make an ask. You notice who flatters you publicly while quietly weakening you behind the scenes. You notice who carries endless explanations but never carries responsibility. You notice how stories shift depending on who's listening. That's not pessimism. That's clarity. Because once you can read motive, you stop making decisions based on emotional theater. You stop being pulled by urgency, guilt, praise, or pressure. You stop reacting to tone and start tracking trajectory. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people aren't consciously deceiving. They're convincing themselves first. They don't admit they want control. They call it concern. They don't admit envy. They rename it honesty. They don't admit hunger for attention. They frame it as being overlooked. But you don't get absorbed by the wrapping. You ignore the story and examine the exchange. What do they gain if you accept this? What do they lose if you refuse? What changes if you don't respond the way they anticipate? That's why this ability feels almost instinctive. It isn't mysticism. It's pattern recognition applied to human behavior. One of the old strategists pointed out that most people judge by appearance rather than by consequence, because sight is easy and depth takes effort. That observation matters because it exposes how easily people are swayed by confidence, titles, polish, charm, and volume. They confuse presentation with reliability and boldness with truth. You don't. You recognize that the most fluent voice in the room can be the most hazardous one, because fluency can be used to sell a version of reality that serves a private agenda. And when you can see the motive, you become part of someone else's design. So you learn to listen differently. You pay attention to what's absent. You notice questions that never get answered cleanly. You track how fast blame changes direction. You observe when specifics are avoided while emotional phrases get recycled. You recognize when speed is introduced to force agreement, because urgency is a common lever. Pressure first, explanation later. Instead of challenging every inconsistency, you collect evidence. You let time expose the pattern, because words can be rehearsed indefinitely, but behavior reveals itself through repetition. This trait also changes how you handle conflict. When someone escalates emotionally, you don't immediately feel threatened. You ask what that emotion is attempting to control. When someone withdraws, you don't chase warmth. You ask what's being withheld and why now. When generosity arrives suddenly, you don't rush into gratitude. You ask what obligation is being planted. This is how you protect your mental space. Not through hostility. Not through cynicism. Through awareness. Through staying awake. Let this settle and mark it. I see intentions. The third signal shows itself in how you ask questions. Some people poke around because they're restless, killing time, chasing novelty. That's not you. Your curiosity comes from hunger. Not hunger for gossip, not for surface-level facts that feel impressive for a moment and evaporate just as fast. Yours is focused. It has direction. It bites. You don't ask questions to decorate your image. You ask because you want precision. And precision changes outcomes. Most people skim the surface of their own lives. They accept the first explanation handed to them. They treat rules as if they were laws of physics. They hear that's just how it works and stop thinking. They move through careers, relationships, and institutions without ever lifting the hood to see what's actually driving the machine. You're wired differently. Your mind naturally presses past appearances. You want to know what supports the structure beneath the structure. So you study incentives instead of excuses. You track results instead of promises. You follow cause and effect like a trail. You look for the unseen forces that shape behavior. You notice when a policy isn't about protection but about compliance. When a trend didn't emerge naturally but was planted and watered. When a rule survives because someone profits from obedience. And once you start seeing reality through that lens, you become difficult to manage. Because you recognize that most situations aren't accidents. They're shaped by routine, culture, money, fear, ambition, ego. You start asking the questions that make comfortable narratives wobble. Who benefits if this stays the same? Who gets hurt if it changes? Who receives rewards, status, or insulation from consequences under the current setup? What would collapse if people stopped playing along? That's curiosity sharpened into a tool. Curiosity that exposes the board beneath the pieces. And that's why it signals intelligence. The person who understands the system can move within it without being owned by it. Most people respond by pushing harder. You respond by positioning better. You don't rely on effort alone. You look for leverage. You search for the pressure points where a small shift changes everything. You study why certain people advance with less resistance. Why some personalities rise faster than others. Why authority sometimes forms around individuals who haven't earned it. You're not captivated by highlight reels. You're focused on mechanisms. Because once you understand the mechanism, you can reproduce the outcome without copying the person. This trait leaks into everyday life. You don't swallow advice just because it sounds confident. You want the reasoning behind it. You don't follow someone just because they project certainty. You want to know what experiences shaped that certainty and whether it's justified. You don't accept labels like good or bad without asking whose standard is being used and who benefits from it. That level of curiosity doesn't make you irritating. It makes you dangerous, because it makes you difficult to mislead. There's another layer most people miss. Curiosity isn't only about acquiring new information. It's about noticing what others overlook. You pay attention to subtle signals. Timing. Reactions. Patterns. You understand that in real life, the most important truths are rarely announced directly. They surface through repetition. Through what gets rewarded consistently. Through what gets punished quietly. Through the things people pretend not to care about while secretly organizing their lives around them. So you don't just learn. You decode. And that decoding changes the way you speak. Your questions aren't scattered. They're precise. They land exactly where they need to. They slow conversations down. They expose inconsistencies. They corner illusions. Because a single well-placed question can dismantle what 100 arguments can't touch. That's why your curiosity functions like a weapon. Not because you want to harm people, but because you refuse to be ruled by confusion, false narratives, or shallow explanations. There's another side to this trait that separates you even further. You're willing to be wrong. Most people cling to their beliefs because being wrong feels like an attack on their identity. You care more about accuracy than self-image. When your investigation uncovers a stronger truth, you release the old one without drama. That flexibility compounds. It sharpens you year after year while others fossilize inside pride. So when you enter a room, you're not just hearing voices and reading faces. You're scanning frameworks. You're mapping incentives. You're watching how power moves, what people protect, what they avoid, what they chase. That's not paranoia. That's intelligence applied to the real world. The fourth signal is quieter but just as revealing. You don't collapse into boredom easily. Most people aren't exhausted. They're understimulated in a shallow way. So they chase noise. Endless scrolling. Constant refreshing. Manufactured arguments. They mistake motion for progress. But it isn't productivity. It's anesthesia. A way to avoid sitting alone with their thoughts for more than a few seconds. You're different. You can sit in stillness without feeling hollow. You don't panic when nothing is happening. You don't require constant input to feel alive. Your mind stays engaged without begging the world to entertain it. That capacity is rare, and it quietly signals high intelligence. Because boredom isn't really about time. It's about depth. When someone gets bored quickly, it often means they can generate meaning internally. They need external stimulation to feel something. They crave novelty because their attention fractures before anything solid can form. You can stay with one idea long enough to understand it. You can stay with one skill long enough to master it. You can remain in one phase long enough to grow roots. That alone puts you ahead of most people. Because nearly everything that matters unfolds slowly. Competence takes time. Influence takes time. Trust takes time. Anything real demands patience. The person who can tolerate slow will never build something durable. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Modern systems are designed to fracture your focus. They profit from distraction. They feed impatience, outrage, quick pleasure, instant validation. Because a scattered mind is easier to guide. But you're not easily guided. You don't need constant stimulation to feel stable, which means stimulation doesn't own you. You can step back. You can disconnect. You can sit in quiet long enough for your thoughts to arrange themselves. And when your mind isn't crowded, your decisions improve. This shows up in how you treat empty space in your day. Most people see free time as a gap to be filled with anything. You treat it like a workshop. A place to refine, to prepare, to organize, to strengthen the parts of yourself others neglect. And that mindset aligns directly with the old strategic way of thinking. Power isn't built in chaos. It's built in moments of calm that others waste. There's a line attributed to an old strategist that hints at something most people misunderstand. It doesn't praise endless labor or glorify exhaustion. It points to awareness. To the idea that calm periods are not pauses in life, but preparation zones. When everything feels stable, that's when you store strength. That's when you sharpen tools without alarms ringing. That's when you grow quietly, without resistance. Because pressure always comes. It never announces itself. And when it does, most people wake up too late. They begin planning after damage has already been done. They start learning when the cost of ignorance is already being collected. They try to build discipline only after something valuable has cracked. You don't operate that way. You treat peace like training ground. You use stillness to become formidable. Another reason this signals intelligence is simple but rare. You're comfortable with delayed payoff. You don't need constant excitement to stay committed. You can do repetitive, unglamorous work today because you understand the exchange it creates tomorrow. You can show up for the same practice, the same routine, the same focus, not because it feels good, but because it compounds. You're building an outcome, not feeding a feeling. That's why you often appear composed on the surface, while internally your mind is active, connecting patterns, refining angles, projecting consequences. You're not stuck in the present moment. You're tracking trajectories. You're seeing where this path leads if you stay on it. And because you're not addicted to stimulation, you're harder to distract. You don't get pulled into every manufactured crisis. You don't chase every trend that flashes across a screen. You don't let every opinion rent space in your head. You curate your inputs. You decide what deserves your focus. That selective attention is power. So if you've ever been labeled distant, overly quiet, too serious, or told you spend too much time alone, understand this clearly. Your ability to remain engaged without constant noise is not a flaw. It's an advantage most people never cultivate. The fifth signal is subtle but decisive. You don't feel the urge to prove how smart you are. That restraint alone puts you ahead. Because the moment intelligence becomes something you need to display, it stops functioning as a tool and turns into a performance. And performance is costly. It drains energy. It pulls you into unnecessary conflicts. It tempts you to speak when silence would protect you, to argue when walking away would serve you better, to correct people when letting them stay wrong costs you nothing. Most people can resist that pull. They need to win conversations. They need acknowledgement. They need the room to validate them. They need someone to say they're impressive, because without that reflection they feel invisible. You don't chase that mirror. You understand that intelligence isn't an outfit you wear for approval. It's an instrument you use for results. So you don't turn every interaction into a debate stage. You don't fix every flawed statement you hear. You don't dismantle every weak idea just to prove you can. You choose your engagements deliberately, like someone managing resources, not like someone fighting for attention. That selectivity is dangerous in the best way because it preserves your energy for situations that actually matter. Inside your mind, the hierarchy is clear. Outcomes outrank applause. You're not trying to look sharp. You're trying to move correctly. Sometimes that means letting the loudest person take center stage while you secure the advantage. Letting someone believe they're leading while you quietly influence direction. Letting a conversation end unresolved because resolution isn't always the objective. This way of thinking understands something fundamental. Ego is a vulnerability. Ego makes people predictable. Ego makes them reactive. Ego makes them easy to provoke. When someone needs to defend their image, they can be steered with a single insult, a public challenge, a slight disagreement. They'll rush into conflict to protect their identity, and in that rush they expose insecurity, lose leverage, and make mistakes. You don't give people that access. You don't respond to every provocation. You don't treat every slight as a call to arms. You don't personalize every disagreement. You separate who you are from what's happening. That emotional distance isn't coldness. It's intelligence. Because when you're not emotionally entangled, you can see the entire field. You can spot the hidden objective behind the conflict. You can recognize when the argument isn't about truth, but about dominance. So you pause. You ask yourself what happens if you don't react. What you gain by staying calm. What you lose by getting pulled in. Most people never ask those questions. They react on impulse, defend reflexively, perform under the illusion of strength. You know better. You understand that strength isn't measured by how many arguments you win. It's measured by how many unnecessary fights you avoid. Walking away from a conflict that offers no return isn't weakness. It's precision. When you speak, it's because your words change something. When you step in, it's because the outcome shifts. When you correct someone, it's because there's a real consequence, not because your pride can tolerate an error floating in the air. People sense this. Even if they can't articulate it, they feel it. They notice you're not hunting for approval. They feel you're not trying to impress. They sense you're not desperate to be understood by everyone. And that gives your presence weight. Desperation is light. It drifts. It begs. But grounded certainty carries mass. This trait also shields you from one of the fastest ways intelligence erodes. Over-explaining. People who need to prove themselves talk too much. They justify. They stack words on top of words. They defend points that never needed defense. And in doing so, they leak doubt, emotion, insecurity. You don't do that. You state what matters cleanly or you let silence do the rest. Because a strong mind doesn't shout for recognition. It grows quietly. It advances quietly. It wins quietly. Let this settle. I don't perform. The sixth signal is refined strategy. You can lead people to conclusions without triggering resistance. This is influence without friction. Most people try to persuade by force. They push, lecture, insist, explain endlessly. And the moment they push, the other person pushes back. Even a good idea gets rejected when it arrives wrapped in control. You understand that resistance isn't usually against the idea itself. It's against the feeling of being handled. So you don't force alignment. You cultivate ownership. You guide someone toward a conclusion in a way that feels discovered, not delivered. It feels like it came from their own reasoning, their own values, their own choice. That's why this skill is so effective. Once someone believes the idea is theirs, they defend it instinctively. It becomes part of who they are. You don't argue. You don't battle. You frame. You do it with questions that narrow the path quietly. Questions that remove weak options without confrontation and illuminate the strong one. Questions that invite the other person to say the answer out loud, because once they say it, it solidifies. You don't rush this process. You respect timing. You let them move at a pace that feels safe. You give space for the dots to connect naturally. Because when people connect dots themselves, trust forms. They stop feeling managed and start feeling self-directed. This trait also means you understand emotional readiness. Some people need respect before logic can land. Some need certainty before commitment is possible. Some need to feel autonomous before cooperation emerges. So you don't deliver the same message the same way to everyone. You adapt the channel without altering the truth. You know persuasion isn't just about facts. It's about timing, tone, and entry point. That's why you often succeed without creating enemies. You don't humiliate people into agreement. You don't corner them. You don't force public admissions of error. You give them a path to the right decision that preserves dignity. And that isn't softness. Preserving dignity is leverage. Someone who feels respected is easier to align with. Someone who feels exposed becomes unstable. An old strategist once pointed out a quiet truth about human perception. Most people only notice the surface. Very few ever touch what's underneath. That idea sits at the core of real influence, because the person you guide should always feel like they chose freely. They should experience the decision as their own work, their own conclusion. Your hand stays unseen, not out of deception, but because visible control triggers resistance. So you don't fight human nature. You move with it. You understand that people resist commands but respond to options. They dislike being corrected, but they enjoy being asked. They reject force, yet soften when they feel understood. That's why you frame instead of order. You don't say do this. You say, which option actually leads to the result you said you wanted? You don't say, you're wrong. You ask, what would have to be true for this to work in reality? You don't say, my way is better. You say, if we tried your approach first, what would success look like? Watch what happens. The other person keeps moving, but now the direction is shaped. You're not wrestling their ego. You're letting it sit comfortably while you quietly steer. When this is done well, you don't just alter decisions. You reshape behavior. People commit harder to what they believe they chose. They defend it. They take responsibility. They stop needing constant oversight. That's real influence. Not dominance. Not volume. Not fear. Alignment. The strongest influence doesn't argue. It redirects. The final trait draws the line between the precise and the reckless. You don't react. You calculate. Reaction is automatic. Calculation is deliberate. Most people function like exposed switches. Press the right insecurity and they erupt. Touch the right pride and they perform. Trigger the right fear and they lose control. And once someone can be triggered, they can be guided, because their behavior becomes predictable. If you carry this trait, you're not easily triggered. Not because you're numb. You feel emotion fully. You just refuse to let it drive. You treat emotion as information, not command. So when someone provokes you, you don't rush to mirror their heat. You don't trade disrespect. You don't fire back just to feel relief. You pause. You breathe. You view the moment as a board of positions, not a brawl in the street. That pause changes everything because it creates choice. Most people don't want choices. They want release. They want to say the thing that feels good now. They want the quick win, even if it costs them the long game. You're different. You're outcome-focused. So your mind asks questions in real time that others never ask. What does responding now cost me? What do I gain by staying composed? What happens if I say nothing and let them keep going? What's the real objective here? Truth, dominance, attention, or ego? Those questions drain chaos of its power. And clarity gives you leverage. This also shapes how you handle disrespect. You don't confuse rudeness with threat. You don't mistake volume for authority. You don't treat every slight like an emergency. You assess. Is this person dangerous or just noisy? Is this conflict meaningful or just emotional static? Is this about principle or pride? Then you choose a response that protects your position. Sometimes that response is direct. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's humor. Sometimes distance. Sometimes a firm boundary. Sometimes you exit entirely. The key is this. Nothing is automatic. Everything is selected. That's why people struggle to control you. They can't predict you. And disciplined unpredictability unsettles impulsive people. They want you reactive so they can label you. They want you emotional so they can justify themselves. They want you loud so they can manage you. You deny them that. You stay composed. And that composure forces others to carry their own behavior without your help. When you don't react, their drama collapses under its own weight. Their manipulation has nothing to stick to. Their attempt to derail you fails. Over time, that self-control creates authority without effort. It signals one thing clearly. You're not governed by the room. This trait also defines how you make decisions. You don't choose under pressure. You don't commit because someone else manufactured urgency. You don't rush because you fear missing out. You slow time down. You examine consequences. You ask, if I say yes, what opens and what closes? If I walk away, what leverage remains? If I wait, who loses control? Most people don't look that far. They act on impulse and then act surprised by the damage. You calculate because you understand a simple law. Impulsiveness always sends the bill later. So you respect timing. You know the same word spoken at different moments can create opposite outcomes. You understand patience isn't weakness. It's leverage. You know silence can outweigh any reply. And when you finally act, you act clean. No hesitation. No emotional spillover. Just direction. That's why this final trait protects all the others. Silence, perception, curiosity, solitude, humility, influence, none of them matter if your emotions can be hijacked. But if you can calculate under pressure, your advantage stays intact anywhere. If you recognized yourself in these traits, understand what that means. Your intelligence isn't loud. It's exact. It doesn't beg. It doesn't chase validation. It doesn't waste energy trying to convince every voice in the room. It moves with control. The sharpest minds don't just think. They position. They choose timing over impulse. Leverage over ego. Observation over noise. While others react to life, they shape it. The world is full of capable people who lose not from lack of talent, but from lack of discipline. They speak too soon. Trust too fast. Argue too much. trade power for momentary relief, and then wonder why they're outplayed. But if you carry these 7 traits, you're built differently. You know when to be silent. You read intent. You study systems. You grow in quiet. You win without display. You influence without force. And you stay calm when pressure rises. That's more than intelligence. That's strategic intelligence. And in a world driven by reaction, the ones who calculate always prevail. If this described you, don't just consume it. Apply it. If you want more strategy, perception, and psychological edge, subscribe. These videos are built to train clarity, precision, and composure under pressure. And share this with the one person who never says much, but is always 3 steps ahead. You know exactly who that is. And if you're serious, leave this affirmation. I move with precision.